In the archives of the United States National Weather Bureau, Record Group 27, held today at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, there are internal communications from the summer and fall of 1900 that most Americans have never been told to look for. They document an institutional policy, a deliberate, written, and forced policy that said, in effect, ignore the warnings coming from Cuba. Do not forward them. Do not credit them. They are not ours. On the morning of September 8, 1900, a hurricane came ashore at Galveston, Texas. Before it arrived, men in Havana had been watching it for days. They had tracked its path. They had sent telegrams. They had done everything a scientist does when he sees something catastrophic coming toward populated land and believes his job is to warn people. Washington received those warnings. Washington decided they did not matter. By the time the sun rose on September 9th, somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people were dead. Galveston, the largest city in Texas, the fourth busiest port in the United States, a city that held more wealth per capita than almost anywhere else in the country, had been effectively erased from the American map. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, not the deadliest hurricane, the deadliest disaster, full stop. And the question that the official history has never answered cleanly is this: how much of that death toll was the storm, and how much of it was the decision made in an office in Washington by a man protecting his institution's monopoly on authority to make sure the right warning never arrived in time?
Here is what most Americans learn about the Galveston hurricane, if they learn anything at all. On September 8, 1900, a powerful storm, what we would now classify as a Category 4 hurricane, struck Galveston Island, Texas. The island sat at most 9 feet above sea level. The storm surge reached 15 feet. The city had no seawall. Thousands died. The disaster prompted one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in American history, the construction of a 17-foot seawall and the physical elevation of the entire island using dredged sand. Galveston survived, and the story is remembered, when it is remembered, as a tragedy of nature, the kind of catastrophe that reminds us how small we are against the forces of the earth. That is the version taught in the textbooks that mention it at all. It is not false, but it is constructed in a way that removes the human decisions from the center of the story and replaces them with weather. I came to this story through the Weather Bureau archives, not through the disaster itself, through the institution that was supposed to prevent it. When I started reading about Willis Moore, the man who ran the U.S. Weather Bureau from 1895 to 1913, I kept finding the same pattern. A man who treated government science as a personal fiefdom, a man who suppressed data that threatened his authority, a man who faced 2 separate congressional investigations for corruption during his tenure, and who was still in office, still making institutional decisions when the warnings from Havana failed to reach Galveston. Once I saw that, I could not look at September 8, 1900, the same way again. To understand what happened before the storm, you have to understand where hurricane science actually lived in 1900. It did not live in Washington. The best hurricane tracking in the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th century was being done by a group of Jesuit priests at the Belén Observatory in Havana, Cuba. Father Lorenzo Ganguite and his colleagues had spent decades observing storm patterns in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Their methodology was rigorous.
Their track record was documented. When a storm system formed in the Atlantic and moved through the Caribbean, the Jesuit meteorologists in Havana saw it first, tracked it most accurately, and understood its behavior most completely. The United States Weather Bureau knew this. Willis Moore's response was not to collaborate with them. It was to issue internal directives, documented in the Weather Bureau's own records, limiting the forwarding of Cuban hurricane warnings to American stations. The Bureau did not want to share its authority over American weather forecasting with foreign scientists, even foreign scientists who were better at the specific thing in question. The Cuban data was treated as a competitive threat to institutional prestige, not as information that might save American lives. This is not a fringe interpretation. Eric Larson documented it in Isaac's Storm, his 2000 history of the Galveston hurricane, drawing directly on Weather Bureau archival material. The policy existed, it was in force, and it was in force in September 1900. As the storm system that would become the Galveston hurricane crossed Cuba in early September, Father Gangwhite's observatory tracked it. Warnings were sent by telegraph, indicating the storm was moving into the Gulf of Mexico and represented a serious threat to the American Gulf Coast. Those warnings did not reach Galveston in any form that changed behavior on the ground. The Weather Bureau's official forecast on September 7th and into the morning of September 8th projected the storm moving toward the Florida Panhandle. It was moving toward Texas. I want to be careful here about what I am and am not claiming. The Weather Bureau's failure to accurately forecast this storm was not unique to 1900. Hurricanes were difficult to track with the technology available, and the Cuban meteorologists, despite their superior methodology, were also working with limited tools.
There is a legitimate historical debate about how much earlier and more accurate a complete transmission of their data would have been. The honest answer is, we cannot calculate with precision how many lives better warning would have saved. What we can say with precision is that a deliberate institutional policy existed to discount the best available tracking data, and that policy was made not in service of science, but in service of bureaucratic authority. That distinction matters enormously. The second layer of this story sits inside Galveston itself and inside the career of one man. Isaac Cline was the chief meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston in 1900. He was a trained scientist and, by the accounts of those who knew him, a capable one. But in 1891, he published an article in the Weather Bureau's own official bulletin that would follow him for the rest of his life. In that article, Cline argued that a hurricane could not cause a catastrophic overflow of Galveston Island. He cited the island's geography, the gradual slope of the seafloor offshore, the way the island itself would channel and dissipate surge energy. His conclusion was, in effect, Galveston is safer than people think. That article shaped how the city, the Bureau, and Cline himself approached the question of storm vulnerability for nearly a decade. When engineers and local officials raised the possibility of building a seawall in the years before 1900, that proposal met resistance. The resistance came partly from business and property interests who understood that a seawall was an advertisement of vulnerability, that building one would signal to investors and residents that the island could be destroyed, which would damage property values and commercial confidence. Those concerns are documented in city records. The men who had the most to lose from Galveston's reputation for safety had the most influence over Galveston's decisions. And they had, sitting in the official Weather Bureau record, an article by the chief local meteorologist saying the island was not as dangerous as the alarmists claimed. No seawall was built. The third layer concerns what happened in the hours before the storm made landfall, and what it reveals about how institutions behave when they are about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On the morning of September 8th, as the storm approached, Isaac Cline rode horseback along the beach, warning residents to move to higher ground.
He later described this in his memoir, Storms, Floods, and Sunshine, published in 1945, claiming he had personally saved thousands of lives through his warning efforts that morning. His brother Joseph, also stationed at the Galveston Bureau, sent a telegram to Washington that morning, warning that conditions were serious and deteriorating rapidly. Both of these things are documented. What is also documented is the timing. By the time Isaac Cline was riding along the beach, the storm was already upon the city. The surge was already beginning. The window for evacuation, real evacuation, of the kind that would have required a day or more of preparation, had already closed. The warning that morning was not nothing. Historians debate whether it saved lives, and it likely did. But a warning delivered as the surge arrives is a profoundly different thing from a warning delivered with enough time to move tens of thousands of people off a barrier island. That earlier warning, the kind that only comes from accurate tracking of a storm's path before it enters the Gulf, never arrived. The fourth layer is the death toll itself, and what it tells us about the scale of what was lost. The official early count was approximately 6,000 dead. The bodies were so numerous that initial plans to bury them at sea failed. They washed back to shore. Mass cremations followed across the island, burning for days. The National Hurricane Center today uses 8,000 as its working estimate. Some historians place the toll at 10,000 or higher. The variance exists for a documented reason. The island's population on that particular weekend included an unknown number of transient workers, travelers, and visitors who had no formal records in Galveston. They were there. They died. They were never counted.
8,000 confirmed dead. An unknowable number of unnamed dead beyond that. The deadliest single day on American soil since the Civil War. His name was Isaac Cline, and the most honest way to tell his story is to hold two things at the same time. He was not a villain. He was a scientist working within an institution that rewarded confidence over uncertainty, authority over accuracy, and the protection of the Bureau's reputation over the admission of its limitations. He had built his professional identity in part on the claim that Galveston was safer than the catastrophists said. When the storm came, he did warn people. He rode along the beach in the wind and rain and told families to move. His wife, Cora Mae Cline, died in the storm. He lost her in the surge that took their home while he was still working. He spent the rest of his career, he lived until 1955, 55 years after the storm, maintaining that his warnings had saved thousands and that nothing more could have been done. Historians have challenged that account, gently but persistently. The 1891 article existed, the institution existed, the policy existed, the seawall did not, and Cora Cline is buried in Galveston. What Isaac Cline's story reveals is something more uncomfortable than a villain in a government office making a decision to let people die. It reveals how institutional science fails, not through malice, but through the human need to have been right. A man publishes an article. The article becomes part of his identity. His institution adopts it as policy. The policy shapes the city's decisions, and when 9,000 people die because the city was not prepared, the same man who contributed to that unpreparedness is the one writing the memoir about how he saved everyone he could. No conspiracy required, just the ordinary human mechanics of an institution protecting its own version of events. Willis Luther Moore was not in Galveston on September 8, 1900. He was in Washington, D.C., running the Weather Bureau from its headquarters,
an institution he treated, by the documented accounts of his subordinates and the findings of 2 congressional investigations, as his personal property. Moore was investigated by Congress in 1902, 2 years after Galveston, for corruption, misuse of government funds, and self-dealing. He survived that investigation. He was investigated again around 1910. He was forced to resign in 1913, 18 years after taking office, after the accumulated evidence of his institutional misconduct became impossible for Congress to ignore. The specific policy he enforced, discounting Cuban meteorological data, limiting the forwarding of warnings from Havana, was not made for Galveston. It predated the storm. It was made because the Jesuit meteorologists in Cuba were better at tracking Gulf hurricanes than the Bureau was, and Moore chose institutional ego over scientific cooperation. That choice did not cause the storm, but it structured the information environment in which the storm arrived. It determined what data reached Galveston, when it arrived, and how seriously it was taken. There is no document showing Willis waking up on September 7, 1900, looking at a map and deciding to let Galveston die. That is not the claim, and the documented record does not support that claim. What the documented record supports is this: a man running a government science institution made deliberate decisions to suppress competing data sources in order to protect his bureau's monopoly on meteorological authority. Those decisions were part of a broader pattern of institutional misconduct that Congress investigated and eventually punished. And in September 1900, those decisions were in effect when the deadliest hurricane in American history approached the Gulf Coast. The suppression was real. The motive was institutional self-protection. The consequences were catastrophic. And Moore never answered for Galveston specifically, not once.
If this were a single failure, one storm, one bureau chief, one city, it would be a tragedy and nothing more. But it is not a single failure. The pattern of the Weather Bureau dismissing data that contradicted its institutional position did not end with Moore. It did not end with Galveston. It continued. In September 1938, a hurricane struck Long Island and New England with almost no warning to the populations in its path. The Weather Bureau, relying on its own models rather than integrating available data from ships and other sources pointing to a northward turn, had projected the storm would curve out to sea. It did not. 600 people died across Long Island, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. The institutional arrogance that contributed to 1900 contributed again to 1938. In September 1928, a hurricane struck Lake Okeechobee in Florida. Between 2,500 and 3,000 people died, the overwhelming majority of them black migrant farm workers living in low-lying areas around the lake with no warning infrastructure and no evacuation plans. The death toll dwarfed the loss of life in many better documented American disasters. The federal and state response was slow, underfunded, and, by documented accounts, shaped by the racial politics of 1920s Florida. The Okeechobee dead received a fraction of the national attention, the relief resources, and the historical memory given to Galveston. And 29 years before Galveston, in 1889, the South Fork Dam above Johnstown, Pennsylvania collapsed and killed more than 2,000 people. The dam was owned by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, whose membership included Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon. Engineers had documented the dam's deteriorating condition in the years before the failure. The club's members knew. They chose not to spend the money to fix it. After the flood, the most powerful men in American industry faced no legal accountability. Not one of them was successfully prosecuted. Every single one of these disasters followed the same structure. Documented warnings existed.
Institutions or financial interests chose not to act on them. The people with the least power died in the largest numbers, and the men whose decisions shaped the outcome either faced no consequences or defined their own legacies before history could do it for them. Galveston was not an anomaly, it was America.
In 2008, Hurricane Ike made landfall near Galveston, Texas. It was a Category 2 storm, less powerful by wind speed than the 1900 hurricane, but it was large and its surge was severe. It struck almost exactly along the same path the 1900 storm had taken. The seawall held. The grade-raised portions of the island behind it survived. Property was damaged. The city was not erased. Across Galveston Bay, the Bolivar Peninsula, outside the seawall's protection, was catastrophically destroyed. Hundreds of homes were simply gone. The death toll from Ike across the United States was approximately 195 people, compared to 8,000. The seawall that Galveston's business interests resisted for years before 1900 is the direct mechanical reason that a comparable storm in 2008 produced a fraction of the death toll. Every life saved in 2008 is, in a documentable sense, evidence of what was lost in 1900 to the decision not to build it. And the National Hurricane Center, the institutional successor to Willis Moore's Weather Bureau, today operates under formal data sharing agreements with meteorological services across the Caribbean, including Cuba. The cooperative framework that Moore's policy explicitly prevented is now official American policy. NOAA publishes these agreements. You can read them. The correction was made quietly, without acknowledgement of what the original policy cost. You are living inside the infrastructure built after Galveston. The warning systems on your phone when a hurricane approaches. The emergency management protocols that tell you which zones to evacuate. The international meteorological cooperation that means a storm forming off the African coast is being tracked by agencies on 4 continents before it ever reaches the Gulf. All of it was built because of what was not in place on September 7, 1900. None of it came with an explanation of why it had not existed before. And the question worth sitting with, the question that connects Galveston to the Weather Bureau, to Moore, to every institutional failure that followed, is not really about hurricanes. It is about what happens when the institution responsible for giving you accurate information has decided that protecting its own authority matters more than giving you accurate information. That dynamic did not end in 1913 when Moore resigned. It did not end with the Weather Bureau. The specific mechanism changes. The underlying structure, an institution with a monopoly on authoritative data, a financial or political interest in one version of events, and a policy of discounting sources that challenge its conclusions, that structure is not difficult to find in the present tense if you are willing to look for it. After the storm, Isaac Cline was reassigned to New Orleans. He continued his career with the Weather Bureau for decades, rising through its ranks, training forecasters, writing reports, and ultimately publishing his memoir, the one in which he described his warning ride on the morning of September 8th and argued that he had done everything that could have been done. He never publicly addressed the 1891 article again in any documented way that historians have recovered. He never named Willis Moore's policy in connection with the Galveston failure. He outlived everyone who could have contradicted him. He died in 1955 at the age of 93. The Rosenberg Library in Galveston holds survivor accounts, letters, and testimonies from people who were on that island on September 8, 1900. Ordinary people. People who had no professional reputation to protect, no institutional career to preserve, no memoir to write.
People who simply recorded what they saw and what they lost and left those records in an archive that most Americans will never visit. Those records sit 2 blocks from a seawall that was built after they were gone. The Cuban meteorologists who tracked the storm accurately enough to have changed what happened, whose data was dismissed by a policy designed to protect an institution's authority, are largely absent from the American telling of this story.
Father Gangoite does not appear in American textbooks. The Bellin Observatory does not appear. The telegram does not appear. What appears is the storm, just the storm, impersonal, inevitable, a force of nature, stripped of the decisions that preceded it. 8,000 people do not disappear because of weather alone. They disappear because of weather and decisions, and the decisions are the part of the story that someone, at some point, chose not to put in the textbook. Here is the question I cannot answer, and I have been sitting with it for months. Willis Moore's policy suppressing Cuban meteorological data was documented, it was in force, it shaped what Galveston received. His corruption was investigated twice by Congress. He resigned in disgrace in 1913. But there is no document, none, in which Moore or anyone at the Weather Bureau was ever asked to account for Galveston specifically. Not in the congressional investigations, not in the institutional record, not anywhere. The policy that contributed to 8,000 deaths was investigated later for financial corruption and eventually punished for that. But the 8,000 were never the subject of the investigation. I do not know if that is because no one thought to ask, or because someone decided it was better not to.